Sometimes losing everything is just the beginning. Sometimes the people who should hold you together are the ones who tear you apart. In the dusty town of Cedar Falls, Emma Patterson screamed through 36 hours of labor to bring life into this world. But life had other plans. Her baby took his first breath, and his last. Her husband took one look at her tear-stained face and decided she was broken beyond repair. So he gave her away to a man who understood that some kinds of broken can't be fixed, only held with gentle hands until the pieces remember how to fit together again. A lonely rancher named Samuel Morrison, who buried his own wife and child 3 winters ago, and knew exactly what drowning in grief felt like. The screaming stopped at dawn. Emma Patterson lay in her blood-soaked bed, arms empty, heart shattered into pieces smaller than dust. The midwife had taken away the tiny bundle wrapped in white cloth, and with it, every dream Emma had carried for 9 long months. Her son. Born perfect. Born silent. It happens sometimes, Dr. Wheeler said quietly, removing his wire-rimmed spectacles to clean them with shaking hands. Nothing you could have done differently, Mrs. Patterson. Sometimes God just calls them home early. But Richard Patterson didn't want to hear about God's plans. He stood by the window, his back rigid as fence posts, staring out at the cemetery where they'd bury their son tomorrow. His reflection in the glass showed a man whose face had aged 10 years in 10 hours. "Richard," Emma whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "Please. Come hold me." He didn't turn around. "I can't." Those 2 words fell between them like a gravestone. For 3 days after the funeral, Richard spoke to Emma only when necessary. He ate his meals standing up, slept in his study, and conducted his business with the focused intensity of a man trying to drown in work. Emma moved through their house like a ghost, touching the empty cradle they'd carved together, holding the tiny clothes she'd sewn with such hope. Her body still ached from birth. Her breasts still carried milk meant for lips that would never suckle. Every mirror showed her the face of failure. On the 4th day, Mrs. Henderson from the general store stopped by with a casserole and unwanted wisdom. "You're young yet," she said, settling her ample frame into Emma's kitchen chair. "You'll have other babies. Maybe this was God's way of preparing you for a stronger child." Emma stared at the casserole, watching steam rise from the cornbread crust. "What if I can't?" "Can't what, dear?" "Have another baby. What if something's wrong with me? What if I killed him?" Mrs. Henderson's face softened. "Oh, honey, you didn't kill anybody. These things just happen sometimes." But Emma had heard the whispers at church, seen the way other women looked at her with pity mixed with fear. As if losing a child might be contagious. As if she carried some curse that could spread to their own swollen bellies. That evening, Richard came home with papers. "I've made arrangements," he said, setting the documents on their kitchen table next to Mrs. Henderson's untouched casserole. Emma looked up from the baby blanket she'd been clutching. "What arrangements?" "There's a rancher outside town. Samuel Morrison. His wife died 3 years back, and he needs help managing his late wife's belongings. Women's things he can't bear to sort through." Emma's hands went still on the soft blue yarn. "I don't understand." Richard's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if chewing words too bitter to swallow. I can't look at you without seeing him, Emma. Without remembering what we lost. Every time I see your face, I see his little fingers, his closed eyes, the way he looked so perfect and so dead." Emma finished quietly. "I need time. We both need time. Samuel Morrison is a good man. A godly man. He'll give you a place to heal while I figure out how—" He gestured helplessly at the space between them. "How to love me again." Richard flinched as if she'd struck him. How to live with what happened. Emma set down the baby blanket and walked to the window where Richard had stood 3 days ago. The cemetery was visible in the distance, marked by a small white headstone they'd chosen together. Thomas Richard Patterson. Born and died March 15, 1887. "What if I don't want to go?" "You don't have a choice," Richard said, and his voice carried the flat finality of a man who'd already made up his mind. "The arrangements are made. Samuel expects you Tuesday morning." Emma pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "You're giving me away like a broken tool you can't fix. I'm giving you a chance to heal somewhere that doesn't remind you of what we lost every minute of every day. This was our son's home. This was our son's grave before he ever drew breath." The cruelty of those words hung in the air like smoke. Emma turned to look at her husband, really look at him, and saw a stranger wearing Richard's face. Grief had carved out his eyes and replaced them with cold stones. "When do I come back?" she asked. Richard gathered the papers, not meeting her gaze. "When you're whole again." "And if I'm never whole again?" He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame, and for a moment Emma thought she saw a flicker of the man who used to read poetry to her belly and talk to their unborn son about fishing and horses and all the adventures they'd share. But when he spoke, his voice was distant as winter. "Then I suppose we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." That night, Emma packed her few belongings in a carpet bag her mother had given her as a wedding gift. She folded the baby clothes carefully between her dresses, wrapped the tiny shoes in tissue paper, and placed Thomas's blanket at the very bottom where her fingers could find it in the dark. Tomorrow, she would meet Samuel Morrison. Tonight, she would say goodbye to the woman she used to be. The woman who believed in happy endings and babies who lived and husbands who held you when the world fell apart. That woman died with her son. What was left barely qualified as living. Samuel Morrison was not what Emma expected. She had imagined someone older, weathered, perhaps desperate enough to accept damaged goods from a man eager to be rid of them. Instead, the man who opened his ranch house door was maybe 35, with kind brown eyes and hands that looked strong enough to gentle wild horses. Richard had driven her to the Morrison ranch in their wagon, speaking only to point out landmarks, the creek where he'd caught his first trout, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring. Everything he said sounded like goodbye. Now he stood behind Emma on Samuel's porch, holding her carpetbag like it weighed nothing, while she clutched Thomas's blanket to her chest like armor. "Samuel," Richard said, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency he used for business transactions. "This is Emma. My wife. She needs." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Samuel's gaze moved from Richard to Emma, taking in her hollow eyes and the way she held herself like something that might shatter if touched too roughly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, tipping his hat. "I'm sorry for your loss." Emma blinked. Richard hadn't told him about the baby, yet somehow this stranger knew exactly what kind of loss she carried. It was written in the slump of her shoulders, the careful way she moved, the emptiness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a dying fire. "How did you?" she began. "I know what grief looks like," Samuel said simply. "Come inside. Both of you." The Morrison ranch house was larger than Emma had expected, built from honey-colored logs with windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. But what struck her most was how empty it felt. Not messy or neglected, everything was clean, organized, purposeful, but empty in the way places get when the people who gave them life are gone. "Coffee?" Samuel asked, but Richard was already backing toward the door. "I need to get back," he said, not meeting Emma's eyes. "Business to attend to." Emma watched her husband retreat, feeling the last thread connecting her to her old life stretch thin and snap. "Richard." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "When will you come for me?" The question hung in the air while dust motes danced in the sunlight between them. Richard's jaw worked silently, and Emma realized he didn't know. Maybe he'd never planned to come back for her at all. "When you're better," he said finally, and stepped outside, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like the lid of a coffin. Emma stood in the sudden silence, clutching Thomas's blanket, listening to the wagon wheels carry her husband away from her. Tears came then, hot and silent, dripping onto the blue yarn she'd knitted with such hope. Samuel moved quietly to his kitchen, giving her space to fall apart without audience. She heard the soft sounds of coffee being prepared, the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the patient rhythm of a man who understood that some kinds of breaking couldn't be rushed. When her tears slowed, he spoke from across the room. "There's a room upstairs that was my wife's sewing room. It has good light, a comfortable chair. You could have that space if you'd like." Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What would you want me to do? In exchange for room and board?" Samuel poured coffee into 2 cups, the sound familiar and comforting. "Nothing you're not ready for. Mary, my wife, she left behind a lot of things I haven't been able to sort through. Women's things. Clothes, books, personal items. I thought maybe having another woman's perspective might help me figure out what should be kept and what should be let go." He set a cup of coffee on the table near her but didn't pressure her to sit. Emma noticed his hands, scarred from ranch work but gentle in the way they moved, careful not to splash or make sudden motions that might startle her. "She died 3 years ago," he continued quietly. "Fever took her and our son both. Winter of 1884. Emma's head snapped up. "Your son?" "6 months old. Joseph." Samuel's voice stayed steady, but Emma caught the slight pause before the name, the way his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. Some winters are harder than others. For the first time since losing Thomas, Emma felt less alone. Not better, grief wasn't something that could be cured by shared misery, but less like the only person on earth who understood what it meant to bury your child. "How do you?" She struggled to find words for the question. "How do you keep living?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold answers. "At first, I didn't think I could. Spent a lot of nights wondering if there was any point to getting up in the morning. But then I realized Mary wouldn't want me to stop living because she couldn't." "Do you still miss them?" "Every day. But missing them isn't the same as drowning in missing them." Emma walked to the window that faced the direction Richard's wagon had gone. The dust had settled. There was no sign he'd ever been there at all. "I don't know how to not drown," she admitted. "Neither did I at first," Samuel said. "But I learned. And if you want, I can teach you." Emma turned to look at him, this stranger who just offered her something her own husband couldn't: patience. Understanding. The promise that drowning wasn't permanent. "Why?" she asked. Samuel's smile was small but genuine. "Because somebody taught me. And because empty houses are too quiet for thinking straight." Emma picked up the coffee cup and took her first sip of something that tasted like maybe, possibly, eventually, she might want to keep living. The first week at Samuel's ranch passed in a haze of careful politeness and shared silence. Emma slept in Mary's sewing room, surrounded by half-finished quilts and baskets full of yarn that still smelled faintly of lavender. The bed was too big, the silence too complete, but it was different from the suffocating quiet of her house with Richard. This was peaceful silence, not the kind that screamed with unspoken accusations. Samuel left her alone mostly, going about his ranch work with quiet efficiency while she moved through his house like a ghost learning to haunt new rooms. He prepared simple meals and left them on the kitchen table with no expectation that she'd eat them, though she found herself picking at the food more each day. On the 8th day, he knocked softly on her door. "Emma? I'm going to start on Mary's trunk today. The one with her personal things. Would you mind helping? Only if you're ready." Emma had been staring out the window at the small cemetery plot behind Samuel's house, where 2 graves sat side by side under a cottonwood tree. Mary Elizabeth Morrison and Joseph Samuel Morrison. Even in death, they had each other. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't sure it was true. The trunk sat at the foot of Samuel's bed, crafted from cedar and bound with brass fittings that had tarnished to green. Samuel lifted the lid carefully, as if he expected ghosts to escape, and Emma caught her breath. The scent hit her first, roses and clean cotton and something indefinably feminine. Then she saw the contents, lovingly preserved and waiting. Dresses folded with tissue paper. A jewelry box made of polished walnut. Packets of letters tied with ribbon. And there, nestled in one corner, A collection of baby clothes so small they might have been made for dolls. Emma's hand moved instinctively to her chest, where her own heart hammered against her ribs. This was Joseph's christening gown, Samuel said, lifting a tiny white dress embroidered with silver thread. His voice stayed steady, but Emma saw his hands tremble. Mary worked on it for months. Said she wanted him to look like an angel when he met God properly. He looked like an angel anyway, Emma whispered. Samuel's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition there, the look of someone who understood that babies could be perfect and still not stay. What happened to yours? He asked gently. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. Thomas. He was born perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the most beautiful face. But his lungs never. She struggled to find words for something she'd never been able to say out loud. He never took that first breath, Samuel finished. He did. Just one. Like he was saying hello and goodbye at the same time. They sat in silence, holding Joseph's christening gown between them like a prayer. Richard blamed me, Emma continued. Said if I'd been stronger, or if I'd done something different, maybe Thomas would have lived. Said looking at me reminded him of what we lost. Samuel's jaw tightened. That's a cruel thing to say to a woman who just lost her child. Maybe it's true though. Maybe I did something wrong. Did the doctor say that? No. Dr. Wheeler said sometimes babies just don't make it. Said it wasn't anybody's fault. Then it wasn't anybody's fault. Emma looked at him sharply. You make it sound simple. Loss is simple. It's living with loss that's complicated. Samuel folded the christening gown carefully, his large hands gentle on the delicate fabric. When Mary and Joseph died, I blamed myself for not getting the doctor fast enough. Blamed God for taking them. Blamed Mary for leaving me alone. How did you stop? I realized blame was just another way of drowning. And I was tired of drowning. They worked through the trunk slowly, sorting Mary's belongings into 3 piles. Keep, give away, and decide later. Emma found herself drawn to Mary's books, poetry collections with pressed flowers marking favorite pages, a cookbook filled with handwritten notes about Samuel's preferences. She loved you very much, Emma observed, reading a margin note that said, Sam's favorite, add extra sugar. 13 years of marriage. We grew up together, married young. I don't know how to be Samuel Morrison without being Mary's husband. Emma understood. She'd been Richard's wife for 3 years, Thomas's mother for 9 months that felt like a lifetime. Without those roles, she wasn't sure who she was supposed to be. Maybe that's something we both need to learn, she said. They reached the bottom of the trunk, where Mary had kept her most precious items. A locket with a picture of her parents. Her wedding dress, yellowed with age but still beautiful. And wrapped in tissue paper, a leather journal with Mary Elizabeth written on the cover in careful script. Samuel stared at the journal as if it might bite him. Her diary, he said. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what she was thinking those last days. Emma understood. Reading someone's private thoughts after they were gone felt like trespassing on sacred ground. Maybe someday, she said. When you're ready. Maybe. Samuel placed the journal gently back in the trunk, along with the wedding dress and locket. Some things need more time. That evening, they buried the baby clothes together under the cottonwood tree, not because they were letting go of Joseph and Thomas, but because some love was too precious to keep locked in trunks. Standing there in the fading light, Emma realized she hadn't thought about Richard once all day. 3 months had passed when the letter arrived. Emma was hanging laundry on the line behind Samuel's house, humming softly, the first time she'd made music since losing Thomas. Her hands had grown steady again, her face had gained color from working in Mary's garden, and the hollow ache in her chest had softened to something bearable. Samuel approached from the barn, holding an envelope with careful fingers. It's from Richard, he said quietly. Emma's hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning. She hadn't heard from her husband since the day he'd left her on Samuel's porch like unwanted baggage. Part of her had wondered if he'd forgotten her entirely. "What does it say?" "I didn't read it. It's addressed to you." Emma wiped her damp hands on her apron and took the letter. Her name was written across the front in Richard's precise script, but something about the paper felt different. Expensive. Official. Inside were 2 documents, a formal letter and what appeared to be legal papers. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, though the endearment felt strange after months of silence. "I hope this correspondence finds you in improved health and spirits. I write to inform you of significant changes in my circumstances that necessitate your immediate return home." Emma's stomach tightened. She read on. "3 weeks ago, I entered into marriage with Miss Victoria Carlyle, daughter of banker Theodore Carlyle. As you may imagine, this union brings considerable advantages to my business interests. However, Victoria suffered a riding accident in her youth that rendered her unable to bear children. Given this unfortunate circumstance, I find myself in need of an heir to secure my legacy." The words blurred as Emma's hands began to shake. Samuel stepped closer, reading the distress in her posture. "Emma," she continued reading aloud, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Therefore I am prepared to welcome you back into my household as my, how does he put this? As my recognized wife for the purpose of providing legitimate offspring, while Victoria remains my social and legal partner." Samuel's face darkened. "He wants you to be his breeding stock." Emma turned to the second document, divorce papers, already signed by Richard, waiting only for her signature to dissolve their marriage completely. "He's giving me a choice," she said, though her voice carried no gratitude. "Come back and bear his children while his new wife plays hostess, or sign these papers and disappear from his life forever." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "What do you want to do?" It was such a simple question, but Emma realized no one had asked her what she wanted in months. Richard had decided she needed to be sent away. Richard had decided she needed to come back. Richard had decided what her life should look like. "I don't know," she admitted. 6 months ago, I would have crawled back to him on broken glass just to hear him say my name kindly. I loved him so much, Samuel. Even after Thomas died, even after he blamed me, I still loved him. And now?" Emma looked around Samuel's ranch, the garden she'd helped plant, the house where she'd learned to laugh again, the graves under the cottonwood where she'd buried her son's blanket and found peace instead of endless grief. "Now I wonder if I loved who he used to be, or who I needed him to be." That evening, they sat on Samuel's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma held Richard's letter in her lap, the paper seeming to weigh more than iron. "He'll provide for you," Samuel said quietly. "Nice house, fine clothes, social position. Everything a woman's supposed to want. Is that what you think I should do? Go back to him?" Samuel was quiet so long Emma thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I think you should do what makes you feel alive instead of just breathing." Emma understood what he meant. For 3 months, she'd been learning the difference between surviving and living. With Richard, she'd survived. Here, with Samuel, she'd begun to live again. "He doesn't love me," she said. "He needs me. There's a difference." "Yes, there is." Emma turned to look at Samuel, this man who'd taken in a broken stranger and asked nothing in return except the gift of her slowly healing presence. "What about you, Samuel? Do you need me?" Samuel's hand found hers in the growing darkness. His fingers were warm, calloused from honest work, steady as mountains. "I need you the way flowers need rain," he said. "Not to survive, I was managing fine on my own. But to bloom again. To remember what it feels like to be truly alive." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, like a door long locked finally creaking open. "And if I stay? What then?" "Then we build something new together. Not trying to replace what we lost, but creating something that honors both Mary and Thomas while giving us reason to wake up grateful each morning. Emma thought about Richard's cold house, his new wife's brittle smile, the prospect of bearing children for a man who saw her as useful rather than beloved. Then she thought about Samuel's gentle hands, his patient heart, the way he'd taught her that grief could coexist with joy if you were brave enough to let both live in the same space. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to learn how to bloom again." Samuel's smile was soft as candlelight. "I think I'd like to learn that too." That night, Emma tore Richard's letter into small pieces and fed them to Samuel's fireplace. Some bridges weren't worth crossing back. Some futures were worth choosing over the past. 6 weeks later, Richard Patterson arrived at Samuel Morrison's ranch with a loaded wagon and 2 hired men. Emma was kneading bread in Samuel's kitchen when she saw the dust cloud approaching. Her hands stilled in the dough as she recognized the familiar slope of Richard's shoulders, the precise way he held his reins. "Samuel," she called, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Samuel appeared from the back room, took one look at her face, and moved to the window. His jaw tightened as he watched the wagon approach. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." But Emma was no longer the broken woman who'd arrived on his porch 6 months ago. She'd learned to tend gardens, to mend fences, to sleep through the night without waking in tears. She'd learned that she was stronger than her grief, braver than her fear. "No," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "This is my choice to make." They walked out onto the porch together, presenting a united front that Richard couldn't miss. Emma saw the moment he recognized the change in her, the color in her cheeks, the straightness of her spine, the way she stood beside Samuel as an equal rather than hiding behind him as a victim. Richard climbed down from his wagon with the measured movements of a man who'd rehearsed this confrontation. His new wife remained seated, a pale, thin woman with nervous eyes who kept glancing between Emma and the loaded wagon as if calculating the cost of this expedition. "Emma," Richard said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "I am well," Emma replied. "Better than I've been in years." Richard's gaze flicked to Samuel, sizing up this man who dared to interfere with his plans. "Morrison, I trust you've taken good care of my wife." "She's taken care of herself," Samuel said mildly. "I just provided the space for her to heal." "Yes, well, that healing time is over." Richard reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I've had my lawyers draw up an agreement. Emma returns home, we put the past behind us, and she fulfills her obligations as my wife. In exchange, she'll want for nothing." Emma looked at the papers but didn't take them. "And what about your new wife? Where does Victoria fit into these arrangements?" Victoria Carlyle Patterson shifted uncomfortably in the wagon seat. She was younger than Emma had expected, maybe 22, with the kind of fragile beauty that suggested she'd never worked a day in her life. Her pale hands twisted in her lap. "Victoria understands the situation," Richard said smoothly. "She knows that certain practical considerations require pragmatic solutions." "Practical considerations?" Emma repeated. "Is that what you call needing an heir?" Richard's patience began to fray. "You are my wife, Emma. Legally, morally, and in the eyes of God. You belong with me. I belong where I choose to be." "You don't get to choose," Richard snapped, his civilized mask slipping. "I gave you time to recover from your difficulties. I've been generous, patient. But this charade ends now." Samuel stepped forward slightly, not threatening but unmistakably protective. "The lady said no, Patterson. That should be enough for any decent man." Richard's face reddened. "Decent? You want to talk about decency? You're harboring another man's wife. You're living in sin." "We're not living in sin," Emma said quietly. "But we are living in love. Something you wouldn't understand." Richard stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Emma, be reasonable. What can this man offer you that I cannot? He's a rancher. A simple man with simple means. I'm offering you wealth, position, security. You're offering me a prison sentence. Emma walked down the porch steps until she stood directly in front of her former husband. Up close, she could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were livestock that had strayed from its pen. I lost our son, she said, her voice carrying across the ranch yard like a bell. I grieved him properly, mourned him fully. You turned that grief into blame and used it to justify throwing me away when I reminded you of your own pain. Emma, I'm not finished. Her voice gained strength. You discarded me when I needed you most, married another woman for money, and now you want me back because your new wife can't give you children. You don't want me, Richard. You want what you think I can provide. Richard's jaw worked silently. Beside him, Victoria Patterson stared at her gloved hands. Samuel wants me, Emma continued. Not for what I can give him or do for him, but for who I am. He held my grief without trying to fix it, supported my healing without demanding gratitude, and loves me without conditions. You loved me once, Richard said, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine pain. I did. I loved you desperately, completely. I would have done anything to make you happy. Emma's eyes filled, but her voice stayed strong. But love isn't supposed to break you. It's supposed to help you put yourself back together. Samuel appeared at her side, solid and warm. Emma's made her choice, Patterson. Time for you to respect it. Richard looked between them, perhaps finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation he could win with money or legal papers or masculine authority. You'll regret this, he said finally, climbing back into his wagon. When you're old and gray and he's tired of playing nursemaid to a barren woman. Emma felt Samuel tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. Maybe, she said, but I'd rather risk regret than guarantee misery. As Richard's wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, Emma leaned into Samuel's warmth and felt, for the first time since losing Thomas, completely and utterly home. That evening, they were married by the traveling preacher in front of Mary and Joseph's graves, with wildflowers Emma had picked herself and rings Samuel carved from the wood of the cottonwood tree. Some endings were really beginnings. Some losses led to greater love. Some choices saved your soul.